This episode of To The Point is sponsored by Tarsus. Tarsus Pharmaceuticals applies proven science and new technology to revolutionize treatment for patients, starting with eye care. Tarsus is advancing its pipeline to address several diseases with high unmet need across a range of therapeutic categories, including eye care, dermatology, and infectious disease prevention. Tarsus is proud to announce that Xdemvy Lotilaner Ophthalmic Solution 0.25% is now available to prescribe.
Ocular surface disease. It's complex, chronic, and progressive, but rife with opportunity for the enterprising optometrist.
The mission of this podcast is to make this condition more understandable and accessible to those interested in specializing in it. So let's get to the point. Welcome to another episode of the To The Point podcast. My name is Jackie Garlich, and I am joined by my co-host, Leslie Odell. And listeners, we've got a great show today. It's just me and Leslie talking to each other. And that's always a good one because I feel like we just spend the majority of the episode sort of goofing around here. But we do have something really great to talk about today. And we're going to talk about one of the newest treatments for our dry eye patients. And the treatment we're going to be talking about is the newly approved, it got approved in May, Miebo. So we're going to...
And Jackie, before you jump further, why don't you tell everybody who's listening how to spell this new drug that we're anticipating?
Leslie. Okay, Leslie, first of all, before I was going to get there, but see, I knew you were going to be ahead of me. You're always ahead. First of all, Leslie, you think that you were joining this call as a co-host, but really, in fact, you are being interviewed for this, okay? Because joke's on you, turns out you're actually a consultant for B&L. So that's wonderful because you know a lot about Miebo. And so you're a great person to talk to about this new drop. But as you said, I think one of the probably most pressing questions that everyone has is, why did they spell it like that, Leslie? Why did they do that? Tell us.
Well, I don't actually have that answer for you,
Leslie,
Jackie.
Why are you even here then? Podcast over.
Okay, podcast over. So for everyone listening, Miebo, when you see it, won't be spelled MEI, like we think about meibomian gland, but it's actually spelled Miebo. And honestly, I'm not sure why, but I'm sure that as this drug launches and we get trained, the speakers trained and we see a lot of that push from the Bausch Lomb team, that we'll have our answer. But for now, when you're charting and maybe making your wait list of patients to this new therapeutic, just remember Miebo. I actually have to think about that.
So did I thought the same thing. Well, so this drop, was FDA approved in May this year, and we have, a lot of options to treat our meibomian gland dysfunction patients. We have thermal expression, we have IPL, we have the mainstay of at-home warm compresses, we have immunomodulators with help with, inflammation. But what are we doing for is there a drop that we can use? So that's something that we haven't or hasn't been explored yet until the advent of Miebo. So maybe we could talk a little bit about evaporation, since there's going to be a lot of talk about that as this drop launches.
Yeah, absolutely. So the big thing that you want to remember, and this goes back to some of the work from TFAS, which I know on our podcast we always have to mention TFAS, but really they have laid such great groundwork around dry eye. It's hard to talk about dry eye without mentioning something that they've done. But this dates back to maybe 2011, or maybe it was even their original dues report in 2007. But what shifted around, I think it was 2011 with the MGD report, was just the focus on if you were trying to classify your dry eye patients, oftentimes you would think about your patient, do they have aqueous deficient dry eye or do they have evaporative dry eye? And with that dry eye, or rather MGD workshop in 2011, this big number came out, which was about 86% of patients that are being treated have a combined approach to dry eye disease, which means you have about 36% of your patients that are living in a aqueous and evaporative state. And then you have about 50% that are in just solely evaporative dry eye disease. And that leaves only about 14% for aqueous deficient. So if you think way back to when dry eye was sort of becoming a, a thing that we were treating 20 some years ago, really a lot of that research was all pushing toward that 14% in the aqueous deficient. So it's a really interesting, change in mindset. And I think that our professions really embrace this one tremendously. I think optometry does really understand meibomian gland disease and evaporative dry eye, and really do, get that foundation started when they're doing their patient evaluation.
Yeah, I totally agree. I feel like the thing most commonly talked about in dry eye forums and dry eye classes is how are we treating our meibomian gland dysfunction patients? And not that we're forgetting about, our aqueous deficient, but it is certainly the hottest topic. I agree with you.
Some things, to remember, and this always becomes kind of my why for, why have I paid attention to dry eye for my patients, is the impact that dry eye can have on our patients. So whether your patient, when comparing patients who had dry eye to not having dry eye, there's significant impact on daily activities. There's significant impact on pain and discomfort for these patients. And then one that I know we've touched on in previous episodes is there is an impact on anxiety and depression and just the mental state of our patients with dry eye. So I think having these options expand are just going to really help ease some of that anxiety that patients have. Oftentimes it stems around them fearing that they're going to run out of options and feel bad, you know. So I think that the changing landscape is going to be a good one for patients. So when you think about evaporation, I'll ask you, when you think about evaporation, what are the things that you're kind of thinking about when you're looking at a patient and you see a rapid tear breakup time?
Yeah, so I mean, I do in my office I do a screening mybography on every patient. So I already have an idea of at least anatomically what their meibomian glands are looking like before I even see the patient. But in every in every exam, I'm literally just pushing on the eyelids just to get an idea of what sort of whether or not there's any obstruction there. So when I look at that rapid tear breakup time, now certainly inflammation on the ocular surface can cause a rapid tear breakup time, but also obstruction of the meibomian glands as well. So a really good look at the lid margin, any blepharitis that needs to be addressed, is there vascularization on the lid margin, like in an ocular rosacea patient. But I'm doing just really a good thorough assessment of these anterior segment structures.
And then how much do you spend thinking about lifestyle? We're learning a lot about this environment, nutrition, even the cosmetics that we talked about on a recent podcast. But how deep, how much time do you have really? And how deep do you go on that first patient encounter?
That's a good point. So I don't know if you have had patients that have come in this way, but the wildfires in Canada have. I've really seen a lot more patients with flare ups that they come in saying, I think it was the wildfires that really did this to me. And so we talk, it's a great segue into saying, yeah, environment really does play a role. And inevitably, there is not time to go to do a deep dive on everything in terms of dry eye and the environmental, cosmetic, et cetera, exposures and exacerbations. But we certainly talk about it. Nutrition plays a role, and we sort of will kind of briefly touch on all of that in my first exam, and then dive deeper in subsequent exams, accordingly.
It might be a great place to build on either your patient portal or education pieces that maybe companies have as lead behinds, because as the COVID restrictions are lifting, I think that those materials can be really helpful and save us time, because it is a hard conversation to have. And there is a lot to cover, and so just having some kind of resource for patients to reference after they leave our office would be really helpful. So maybe you could get working on that.
Yeah. Well, I do have a good handout that I kind of, do check off what is needed along with some other information. But one thing that I am really lacking on is cosmetics. I do probably need I need a booklet. It's not a handout. We're beyond the handout now at this point. I feel like we need a booklet to cover everything.
There you go. You can become an author and
Well,
be you can write a book. I like it. I know that Pam Terrio has a book about dry eye tips for her patients. Some of the big ones, just to keep it simple in the lane, would be talk about sleep, because if patients aren't getting enough sleep, that's going to feed into the evaporative stress that we're seeing with the rapid tear breakup time. Sometimes that feeds into the next one, which is there's a lot of research right now around stress and its impact on dry eye disease. But for me, if I have a patient that's not sleeping very well, a lot of times that's stress related. And then another big one that is kind of easy to talk about because everyone's using it, a constant battle for reducing our screen time, but is just how many hours are we spending on screens, and what can we do to improve kind of the ocular health while we're doing that. And one of the big reasons for this is partial blinks, right? So we know that when our patients are on their screens, they're blinking significantly less, and those full blinks are needed to really spread the tear film across and help delay evaporation and really improve homeostasis for the ocular surface.
yeah, in some ways, I think this topic can be overwhelming to a patient to say, oh, well, we got this going, and then we have environment, and then we have like hormonal things, and then we have, yeah. But in other ways, I think it can actually be really helpful for a patient to know we have a lot of modifiable risk factors that are contributing to their dry eye. So in other ways, I think it is helpful for a patient to know, oh, hey, I can do things on my own that can help improve my situation.
Yeah, I mean, empowering them, I think really does help. I feel like the dry eye patients are their biggest advocates, right? They're always,
Oh yeah.
over the years I've been doing dry eye, those are my patients that come in with literature. They actually like print it off and show me a study or show me something new that's available on the market and ask me what I think about it. So they're definitely, interested in learning as much as they can. But the impact on vision is probably the biggest one that we can feel, that we know that we're in the business of vision, but patients still to this day do not think variable vision has anything to do with dry eye disease, right? So, that is one that I feel, as the literature grows, it's been really exciting to see, hey, this tear film really does have a big impact on vision. We're all in the business of giving our patients the very best vision. So improving the quality of the tear film is something that should be paramount in all of our exams, right? It should be something that we're focused on for everybody because we want all of our patients seeing the best. So whether it's glare, what's interesting for me is when I see patients back and they're improving their ocular surface, they'll tell me things that the glare at night is less, or that they're able to use their screens more, or they could even read at the end of a day when before they couldn't do that. So, I think that when we hear blurry vision, we don't want to always assume glasses, and we want to make sure that that dry eye evaluation is part of those exams.
I think that the most useful thing I have found is to talk more about the blurry vision when a patient does have this. But, like, is it constant? Is it always blurry, or is it come and go? Does it fluctuate? And that fluctuating vision is really critical to sort of tease out your dry eye patients. But in reality, you can really tell a dry eye patient when you've got them in the phoropter. They answer one way one time, they answer another way another time. They're wishy-washy kind of on their landing. So, those people are easier to kind of spot, instead of just saying, oh, it's just a glasses prescription.
Yeah, absolutely. And you usually say like, "Well, I didn't even touch anything," and you're saying
Yeah.
clear or clearer.
Yeah.
Forget the 1 or 2. I didn't even move a dial.
Leslie, you bring up, patients being their best advocates, dry eye patients, and bringing in new information and new studies. Let's use that as our segue into talking about Miebo and what this even is and how does it work. So give us a little rundown on it.
Well, so it was studies under the name Novo 3, and like we talked about, is now going under the trade name Miebo. And thankfully, that word is easier to say than what its chemical makeup is, which is perfluorohexyloctane, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. You did it.
um, so a couple things that really stand out about this novel, and the science has been around in Europe, I think in Germany and a few other countries for about a decade. And so it's not brand new science, but it's brand new to us here in the United States. One of the things that is unique to Mibo is the small drop size. So if you, and part of that is because there isn't water. So all of the drops that we have access to have, they're water based. And so that is part of the composition and the delivery system, if you will, of the drop. And that's one of the biggest things that sets this drug apart is there is no water as part of its solution. And so if the normal drop size of a water-based eye drop is about 40 or 50 microliters, this medication is about 11 microliters. I have had a patient use the product from Germany, and it's so small that literally they can almost not even feel that anything hits their eye. It's amazing. But that it's not the same way that patients like overwhelm their eye and flood it, and then they have all the drops streaming down. But the upside of this is, it can last much longer because it's a micro drop.
Is the bottle size different? Like, is the bottle tip different than, like, I think of like nano dropper, which I use to sort of do a smaller drop for patients, but is this drop bottle different as well?
I'm thinking about this bottle that I had as a sample, not of Mibo, but of its European sister, I'll call it. I don't know what you would call that. But I don't think it was much different, and it didn't look like the top you're describing. Um, and because it's preservative free, even in the bottle, it's not having to go through that system to like eliminate the preservative. It's preservative free. Um, the other thing that's really cool about it is the spreadability. I think the traditional drop sat there like a water droplet, and when you put the Mibo on the same surface, it's spread out completely because it has a much lower surface tension. So that's why it's spreading out over the patient's eye, and they don't realize that that's happening.
This episode of To The Point is sponsored by Tarsus. Tarsus Pharmaceuticals applies proven science and new technology to revolutionize treatment for patients, starting with eye care. Tarsus is advancing its pipeline to address several diseases with high unmet need across a range of therapeutic categories, including eye care, dermatology, and infectious disease prevention. Tarsus is proud to announce that Xdemvy Lotilaner Ophthalmic Solution 0.25% is now available to prescribe.
So when you think about like the wax on the car and the beads of droplets, I think that's the traditional drops, but this still can like lubricate the surface um, within that one drop. And then what's really why I think evaporation, has been really the lead in to us talking today is this still like kind of blows my mind. But if an eye drop traditionally is sitting on the ocular surface for about 3 to 5 minutes, they're finding this in the ocular tissues and the ocular surface for as long as 360 minutes, 6 hours after the drop is instilled.
Wow. Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, that's the issue with eye drops, right? You want longer contact time, but the things that provide that are ointments. That's a really longer contact time, but that's also very visually blurring. And Mibo, as I have read, is not. It has very minimal vision blurring, with the drop. So yeah, that's all sounds wonderful.
So all the good things too that got it through the FDA, and I think also in an earlier approval date than anticipated, were their studies Gobi and Mojave, and these were all the things that you look for in good research, multi-center, randomized, double-masked studies, and they looked at saline compared to Novo 3, or what's now known as Miebo. And the patients were seen for a screening visit. They had their randomization day 1 visit. They were seen at day 15, um, day th- day 29, and then again at day 57. What is a little bit different is that it is QID dosing, and these studies were QID dosing instead of what we're kind of used to seeing with BID dosing.
And do you know how that will impact our contact lens wearers? Can you put this drop on top of a contact lens? That's what I first think of when I go to a QID dosing.
Yeah, I don't think the label is going to say that you can, but I think if you look at that first, off label, it seems like if it's having residence time of 360 minutes with one drop, QID dosing might not be needed for everybody. But I think that's going to be something we have to learn, as it comes into use. So their studies included patients that were over the age of 18. The Gobi had about 597 patients, and Mojave had about 620. And the primary outcome was um, eye dryness score at day 57. And they also obviously looked at safety outcomes and some secondary outcomes. But let me just jump to what I wanted to share about signs and symptoms. So, change in baseline from total. There were two things in that initial study, and I was just getting caught up on the abbreviation, so my apologies there. But change in baseline from total corneal fluorescein staining at day 57, so their end day, and then also change in baseline from that eye dryness score on a visual analogs at day 57. So it again was looking at signs and symptoms, and they were able to achieve superiority in both studies for both of those outcomes.
I this visual analog dryness. Can you talk a little bit about that? That's something I had to really look up prior to this podcast.
Oh, so, and tell me if I'm wrong, but the way I think about that is um, kind of like a happy face on one side and a sad face
Yes.
on the other, and it's a scale 0 to 100, and it's just like at that moment in time, where do you feel?
Yeah. But I haven't, have you seen that in other studies? Maybe I am not paying attention, but I was sort of like, wait, a visual analog dryness scale? I'm like, I actually am into this. I kind of like the idea of a visual analog scale. I'm
Yeah,
like,
so
huh.
it is. I will say the way that I've used it in research, that I have used it in research before, and the way that it looks when I do that is they're given like a rule. I feel like they're given a ruler, or we're given a ruler, and they have to. Maybe they just do mark randomly between the 0 to 100, but then we sometimes had to measure it, and that's how we got like what their symptom was. But basically, it would be like you were measuring 0 to 100 millimeters or something.
Well, as a side note, I do a speed score and on all of my patients as well, but I also really just ask them, hey, what's your level of dryness on a scale of 1 to 10? 10's terrible, one's minimal, and I just feel like that provides me with a lot of information. So I'm all about these visual scales, or this sort of one to 10, or 0 to 10, 0 to 100 sort of scales. I do feel like that provides a lot of sometimes more reality, I don't know, than a speed score. Sometimes you're trying to just be like, how bad are you exactly? Can you just tell me, like where are we? Are we because sometimes it's surprise, like if someone's like, oh, I'm an 8 out of 10, I'm like, oh, yikes, okay, let's deal with that. And then somebody's like, oh no, it's like a 1 or a 2. It just gives you a lot of information, I think, with something very simple like that.
Yeah. I think it's just good to also, like, you can get overwhelmed by those numbers, especially you walk into a speed that's 28 out of 28 and you're like, where do you even start? And I think it's just really good to, in those people, ask those two questions that we talked about before. What is the thing that bothers you the most day to day? And when does it bother you the most?
Yeah,
And then
totally.
I think it just really allows you to kind of hone in on what might be missing, because as you know, a lot of times these patients are here after failing treatment elsewhere, or even failing our own treatments, right? And that we're trying to figure out where we might have gone wrong. I have very limited experience, other than kind of working with Bausch and Lomb on the journey of approval, if you will, just a little bit behind the scenes, like how do we document meibomian gland dysfunction in our office? And I will tell you that it's really hard to document meibomian gland dysfunction in an EHR, right? So I would first say, in order for diseases to kind of jump on the radar and get reimbursement and different things like that, it does fall a little bit on prevalence, right? And so I do think it's important to not only code MGD like blepharitis. These codes, I think, started sometime after 2015. I remember the change where you can say meibomian gland dysfunction, upper lid, lower lid, right eye, left eye, and just becoming familiar with that. And honestly, off the top of my head, I don't know the code, but I can see it in my EHR, and just documenting that, right? And especially, like, even though this doesn't have MGD approval, in your mind, that MGD and evaporation go hand in hand. So this has signs and symptoms of dry eye disease, and it also has some language around improving evaporation.
Yeah,
You have that?
evaporation. Yeah.
Yep.
Mhm.
So I think that for you to code it, appropriately, so you kind of can start thinking about where does it fit. But then the other big question that I have is, where does it fit with my treatments? And I've already been thinking about this, and there's all, for me, I already have a long list of patients on my kind of wait list for when this drug hits the market, which they're hoping Q3 now is, the estimation that I've heard from the team. And that's just now doing, the manufacturing that happens after you get the FDA approval. So I think that by the end of the year, we'll definitely have product in hand. But what I was going to say is, I have a lot of patients that have been through gland clearing treatments, whether it's tear care, iLux, LipiFlow, IPL, all of them. And they still just can't seem to keep good tear breakup time, right? They aren't normalized. They have improved gland function, but they're not perfect glands functioning. And so for me, that's one of my first patients that I'm excited to try this out on. And then the total opposite end of the spectrum, which are the patients that really have no glands for me to treat, and they have instant tear breakup times and tremendous evaporation. I'm really hopeful that it may give them options that I don't yet have available, with what's currently approved. So for me right now, I'm kind of on both ends of the spectrum, thinking about where it fits for my patients. I'm pretty sure the language around contact lenses is going to be not over top, but don't hold me to that either.
Mhm. I mean, that sounds appropriate. I feel like that's what they all are. I think this is, yet another good option for us to treat dry eye patients. It's a different mechanism than what we have seen before. So I think that's very interesting. And I think, it's great to just try it on everyone. I think that's how I get better familiarity with a drop, and it's, how effective it is and for whom it seems to be the most effective. I assume, oh, I shouldn't assume you don't know this, but I'm going to guess you don't know in terms of pricing or patient access, which is always the biggest issue when a new medication comes out. Do they have to fail something or other? Have you heard any news on that front?
I'm not so sure about failure. I mean, I know it's going to be a barrier for Medicare patients. Obviously, they're always the trickiest ones with these new technologies, but I think that they're going to come out like everybody else with good rebates for our commercial patients. And really, the more we do prescribe early in the journey of Miebo, the better it's going to be for the patient in the end, because the insurance companies need to see those scripts to see that there's the demand and the need for the drug for them to put it on formularies. So as sad as it sounds, writing those prescriptions early on really does, help the patient in the end. And I mean, look back to the launch of Lifitegrast and Xiidra. Optometry were 60% of those scripts in their first year. So I think that we can really, I think MGD and evaporative dry eye is really in the wheelhouse of optometry, and we already kind of, have taken ownership of all the other things, nutraceuticals, heat masks, lipid tears, all of that. And I think it just should be an easy transition for us to feel comfortable prescribing this medication. I hope, I hope to see that we can push beyond that 60%. That would be really exciting to see.
One last thing I wanted to ask you is early on in some of the literature about Novo 3, now called Miebo, there was talk of this drop being able to penetrate into the meibomian glands. Is that still a thing? Are they still talking about that?
So definitely not part of these trials that got through the FDA. I was kind of hopeful that that science was going to be the thing as well, that it was changing the composition of the Miebo, but I think this stability in the tear film is going to really be big for patients. But no, that wasn't part of the trial. It was really just improving corneal staining and then improving patient symptoms. And then, of course, they looked at things like tolerance and all of those things. And really, it's a very comfortable drop. So hopefully, that will be um, an easy transition for these patients. I was just looking real quick. Blurred vision was maybe the most common AE, adverse event in the Gobi study, and it looks like blepharitis, which is sort of random, was the most common adverse event in the Mojave study. So not our typical pain. Actually, eye pain only one patient.
Yeah.
So that's really, I mean, that alone is exciting, right? We don't have to talk about this is going to sting and burn and why would that happen? That
Yeah.
sounds
Yeah.
awesome to me.
It's a nicer side effect profile for sure. It's good.
Yes, I would say get your list ready. I have heard that there might not be as many samples as we've seen with other product lines at the beginning. I think that they want to have some first experience, maybe with the doctor themselves, or maybe a staff member or a patient. But the reason for that is I think the sample bottle and the script bottle might be pretty equivocal right now, which might change in the future. Some of the science that is translating into the Bausch and Lomb is coming from Novaleak, which is a German company that developed the medication. So that might change over the next year or two. But what I'm doing is making a list. And so I know as soon as I have access to, you know, drug, I know what the rebate is. I know, who to send to the pharmacy. I can just actually send them to the pharmacy and then schedule them back maybe a month after.
As you're talking about the sample size being similar to maybe the actual prescription, this reminds me of Isuvis and that gigantic sample bottle that they that they give. But I'm wondering if since we have such a smaller drop, that if that is going to feel like there is more value in that bottle as for the price as compared to some of our other options that have the larger drops, just because you're conserving and getting the most of the bottle for for each drop. So
I do think it's going to last the patient. Yeah.
yeah, that's great, Leslie. Thank you for being my guest today on this podcast.
I mean, maybe you were my guest. You just didn't even know it. I pulled it over on you. No, it's good to get back to just how we started. It's fun to have our guests. Don't get us wrong. We love the guests, but sometimes it's nice just to talk to you.
I know. Yeah, same. All right. Well, thanks for talking about Miebo. I'm interested to hear how this plays out as we get experience with the drop and where we see this having the most impact for our patients. So, more to come.
And now for the To The Point wrap up. Fall of 2023 will bring us the newly approved Miebo, a 4-time-a-day medication for signs and symptoms of dry eye disease, recently approved and being carried through Bausch Lomb. This medication is unique because of its small drop size, 11 nanometers, its lack of water-containing eye drops, preservative-free nature, and its tremendous spreadability over the ocular tissues. It is found on the surface of the ocular tissues 360 minutes after drop installation. I think it's going to prove to be a great addition to our treatment bag, another option for our patients who are suffering from dry eye disease and evaporative dry eye disease.